You're listening to Saturday Morning Media. And now, back to our show. Under the Puppet is made possible by the Saturday Morning Media Patreon patrons who support the show over at patreon.com/Saturday Morning Media. Welcome to Under the Puppet, the show that talks to professional puppeteers about the art and business of puppetry with the sole purpose of helping you up your puppet game. My name is Grandpa Choco, and this is Under the Puppet. Howdy there, puppeteers and puppet fans from around the world. This episode features a fantastic interview with Thom Fountain. Now, if you've never heard Thom's name, you've definitely seen his work. He was Puppeteer on Men in Black, Team America, Muppets Tonight, Tales from the Crypt, and was Emmy nominated along with the other Puppeteers for the show DC Follies. He was also the Puppeteer of Salem the Cat on 7 seasons of Sabrina the Teenage Witch. This is a fun interview, and Thom has a lot of great stories and advice. Now, without any further ado, here is my interview with Thom Fountain. Tommy Fountain is a puppeteer who's worked on Men in Black, Team America, Sabrina the Teenage Witch, and was Emmy nominated for DC Follies. Tommy, welcome to the show today.
Thank you so much, Grant. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, I'm excited to talk to you. I would like to start by asking, what's the first puppet you remember seeing?
The very first one was when I was about 3 years old. First of all, let me state, I grew up in Decatur, Georgia, Atlanta, and we had an FAO Schwartz store at one of the local malls. It wasn't like the big one in New York. It was a very small version. But my mom took me in there one day, and amongst all the toys and things that were in the room, the thing that caught my eye was this entire row of Pelham marionettes, and they were out of the box and they were suspended from the ceiling. And my first attraction to it was not so much the puppet at the end of the strings. I was fascinated with the controls and all the strings that came down. It caught my eye, and I asked Mom to get me one, and at the time she said they're too expensive. And I think they were about $15 at the time, but we're talking like 1959, 1960, around there. Mm-hmm. So that was the first time I really laid eyes on a puppet live. Of course, we had them on TV, like with Captain Kangaroo and things, but I never really thought of them as puppets because, you know, a child, an imagination suspends all reality, and to me, Mr. Moose and Mr. Bunny were just as alive as Captain Kangaroo and Mr. Green Jeans.
Right.
So, but yeah, that was the first time. And so my attraction, I guess now looking back, it was more of a technical thing as opposed to artistic.
Well, and I think that's interesting as we'll talk through this thing. It seems that you've worked on most of the projects you worked on have been a little bit away from what I think most folks would consider, like Mr. Moose or Mr. Bunny Rabbit, traditional puppets, like hand puppets like that.
Right.
You've worked with a lot of more technical puppets, marionettes and things like that.
Marionettes were what I started on.
Yeah.
Yes.
So where did you start working?
Well, eventually, I guess I was about 5. Mother eventually bought me one of those Pelham puppets, which ironically was a Pinocchio. And I wasn't really sure what to do with it until Mother and Dad used to take me to the live theater a lot. There was a summer series, outdoor amphitheater, and we saw a production of Funny Girl. And I saw all the sets because the fact it was an amphitheater, everything moved on wagons and wheels, and I was fascinated with the movement of the scenery. And I came home and started making little pieces of scenery out of cardboard and having my character kind of dance around that. Of course, I didn't know anything about scale, so the puppet was much bigger than the than the buildings it was supposed to be in. But so then I sort of tapped on, yes, this is theater, and such. So at 5, I started jiggling, and usually every day the puppet would fall and get tangled, and there was a wonderful lady upstairs who was a teacher named Mrs. Hughes, and she could pull her magic and untangle the puppet.
Yeah.
So it was a commonplace that I was running upstairs at the apartment to give her the puppet, say fix it, and it come down, and about a minute later I'm sure it would fall again. I guess I was clumsy as in my youth.
So did that start just a pattern of getting more and more puppets?
Yeah, we did, but I have to tell you, I wasn't still really set on what to do with them until Sid and Marty Krofft opened their puppet theater at Six Flags Over Georgia. And that was about 1968, I guess, and I was about 10 or somewhere, I don't know, or 11, and we went into the theater primarily to get out of the June heat. It looked like it had air conditioning, and of course summers in Atlanta get pretty humid and hot, and we stepped in not knowing what we were going to see. And I can tell the listeners now, the Krofft theaters, we have nothing like them today. You can't afford them, but these were buildings that were built specifically for the puppets. They sat about 800 to 1,000 people. The stages were huge. They were like, 25 feet by 8, full scenic loft, all the lighting, and puppets came out of the ceiling, they came out of the walls, and they usually had about 15 puppeteers that worked the shows at that time. And all of a sudden my eyes popped out. And it was with my dear childhood friend Mike Dollins. We just became infatuated with it the first time we saw it. It also, too, not only did it have all the scenic and the fast-paced changes, but it was the first introduction of blacklight that we had seen. And of course, we didn't have Spencer's Gifts quite at that time. Blacklight was coming to its own, with the 60s, but as a theatrical technique, it was still kind of a secret.
Right.
Well, we had never seen anything like it. And so that was sort of some would say the road to ruination. But we just became hooked on that theater. And I literally grew up in that theater. My parents would buy me tickets to go to Six Flags Over Georgia, and where everybody else was running to other attractions, Mike and I would go sit in the puppet theater and watch 10 30-minute shows a day.
And did you, at that time, did it dawn on you that this is a job you could have?
Yeah, it did, because eventually we met the puppeteers backstage. We also got to know the ushers, and I'm bringing that up because it relates to how I got into the business. We knew the ushers, and so I was doing my training visually, and eventually the puppeteers allowed us to go sit backstage with this enormous backstage area and watch the show from behind. And then all of a sudden it was like, okay, wow. That was, the kids, how was this magic created? And that was what really made us decide that, yeah, this is something. As a matter of fact, my parents used to joke that the morning after that first trip to Six Flags at 6 a.m., they woke up to hammering and noise down in the basement, and I was trying to create with this little puppet stage Mom had given me that I'd never really quite known what to use, and all of a sudden now I was duplicating things that I had seen in the theater, using whatever I could find to create an effect.
Yeah.
So.
Well, and after that, how did you start your training?
It was trial and error. I didn't really train, but I was interested in everything, and I was also studying music, cello, and I was fascinated by dance, anything. So in a sense, I was doing training, and I wasn't even aware of it because the puppets weren't related, but I was just fascinated with the arts. And then, of course, we would go backstage, and we'd see it duplicated with these, marionettes on 14 feet of string worked from bridges. It's important to note the puppeteers weren't seen at the Krofft show, which added to the magic of it. Strings just went up into the ceiling, and there were all these series of bridges over the theater house and backstage where this magic was created. And so I would see it in real life and then see them kind of duplicated on stage in some form or fashion. And but I didn't really start manipulating until after those Six Flags trips, And then I started working on trying to make things move. And the Croft Theater was like the Lido. These were variety shows, but I mean, on stage you could have something like 10 marionette showgirls and a star moving in unison in choreography. So it was a real challenge to try to make the puppet look realistic, because that's what they did. They still had comedy things too and great illusions, but it was the realism of what these puppets were creating that made all the audience members just, freak sometimes at how real they looked.
And what was your first official job where you got paid for puppetry?
Okay. This is one of my lessons to people, is learn anything and everything you can in theater and show business. You never know when it's going to come in handy. When I turned 16 of working age, I eventually got a job working as an usher at the Puppet Theater so I could watch the shows.
For free?
For free.
Get paid to watch them?
Yes, I got paid to watch them. I think it was a whopping $60 a week. And I would spend my lunch breaks backstage up in the light booth and watch the guys work. And then when the show was over, I'd have to, go out, pick up candied apples, diapers, spilled Coke and such. And you had 15 minutes to get the theater ready for the next group of people that came in. And what happened was, towards the end of the 1973 season in a show, Footlight Frolics, during that time, I had learned the lighting of the show, not because I was instilled on learning it. It just happened from sitting in the booth with the lighting director, Robin Lydon. We're not talking about a computer board, folks. We're talking about a manual Ward Leonard and a Luxtrol, and it was all patchwork and everything locked in and went up. It was very physical, but it was fascinating to me as well. Once again, the technical. And one day I felt pretty secure with working the lighting for the show, so I said, Robin, I want you to sit there and I'm going to run the show, which meant starting the soundtrack and everything. And I did it with one mistake, which he didn't let me forget. I came up too quick on one light, I think. But I started working the show every once in a while during the break. Well, it caused problems with the other puppeteers because the fact Robin was able to get a show off when everybody else had to work. So it was kind of, water was thrown on it. Well, then Robin quit all of a sudden. And the only person besides the spare, who was also a puppeteer in the show, was a 16-year-old usher at the front of the theater. And I spent 2 days cleaning up the diapers and the candied apples, and then I would run backstage, start the show, and I'd work the show, and then I'd come back out and clean. And I did that 10 times a day for 2 days. And then towards the end of the second day, the stage manager, Bill Germain, came up and to the light booth with me when he had a small little breather, and he said, how would you like to work here? And I turned to him and I said, that is a really stupid question. And so the next day I quit Six Flags without notice, and I went from like $60 a week to something like $100 or something, and that was a huge leap. And so that was how I actually got into the business professionally, was working lights. And the next season, when the new show came in, I was called in and I went to the bridge to work because the puppeteers knew I could work the puppets. So
yeah. And how long did you how many seasons did you spend at Six Flags?
Only 2, because the Crofts pulled out of their contract early because they were opening the World of Sid and Marty Krofft in Atlanta at the Omni, which is now CNN Center at the Omni. And they had an ordinance in the contract they could not have a theater within 100 miles of each other. And they had theaters at the other Six Flags parks as well, and the shows used to travel from Atlanta to Texas, and then the third year they went to St. Louis and such. So in 74, we worked the last show, and then it went dark. And then in 1976, the Puppet Theater at the World of Sid and Marty Krofft, which was an indoor theme park, by the way, way ahead of its time. It was really beautiful, but it was way ahead of its time. And that was when I became a lead Puppeteer was at that time for that theater.
And what was the? I mean, you worked there, and eventually you made your way out here to Los Angeles. What was the sort of drive or decision to come out here?
Well, when the World of Sid and Marty Krofft closed abruptly, I might add, bankrupt. It opened at the same time as Six Flags full season. If it had been in the winter time, it would have lasted because it was indoors and controlled. Six Flags would have been closed. That's my own business outlook on it. And there wasn't anything else to really go to. At the time, Vince Anthony had started the Center for Puppetry Arts, but at that time it was very small. They were in the building that they currently are in, but it was basically his road shows inside the cafeteria, or cafetorium as they used to call them then, and we had no idea where it was going to go or what the dream was. Some of the puppeteers from Krofft went to work for Vince. Others went back to where their homes were because a lot of them were not from Atlanta, and the Kroffts had shipped them in. I went back to study music during these high school years because I was supposed to major as a cello student, and I still worked puppets and played with them, and we did our shows. Mike and I had theaters in our backyard, sort of miniature Krofft theaters, duplicating, and so that we would use to keep busy. But it wasn't until much later on I decided not to major in music, and I eventually ended up out here in California, primarily because of the director that we had, Mr. Van Snowden, who was a brilliant puppeteer and director. And Van always kept telling me, you should be in California, you should be in California. And I was nervous about coming out to here, on my own, and what would I do? But eventually you see where you're supposed to be. And I did what I used to admire other people doing. I packed up the car and I came out. And so and I've been here ever since. That was in 1984.
And what was the first project you worked on when you
It was the pilot for DC Follies.
DC Follies.
With Sid and Marty Krofft, yeah. It was the Krofft that gave me the cushion that I needed because I had worked with them for so long and I guess had a reputation. And so we did the pilot for DC Follies, and that was the very first time I really worked in front of a camera. Didn't have an inkling as to really what I was doing. And neither did the scenic designer because all the sets were built on the main floor, and we were supposed to take these life-size puppets and somehow disappear. It was physically extremely painful, but the writing was good.
Yeah,
it didn't look great, even though it aired on TV, but the writing was good, and that was what sold it. So, by the way, Spitting Image was already on in England, and we did not have an equivalent. For some reason, I don't know all the details, but Spitting Image could not get a run in the United States, and the Kroffts took advantage of the fact, and that's when they created DC Follies.
And you wound up being Emmy nominated for that as well.
Eventually, when the show came back, the puppets were completely redone by someone else, and the show took off, and I think we did a total of 87 episodes, but the Emmy Awards came the second year for 2 episodes. We were actually nominated twice the same year, and it wasn't just myself, I have to point out. It was the entire cast of puppeteers that were nominated. I think it was the first time in Emmy history that a group was nominated for a single performance, because it took all of us to do it. I prefer to specialize with female characters. I think they're a lot more fun to do. So I let the others, take care of the guys. And Van and I always did the women. I mean, come on, impersonating Cher and Barbara Streisand and Whoopi Goldberg. I mean, it was great.
Yeah.
And we laughed from 7 a.m. until whenever we wrapped, which could have been, one time it was 4 a.m. It was hard, but we would laugh, and we had such a good time. And I think that shows on the screen of those episodes.
Yeah. What is the best piece of puppetry advice you ever received that you still use to this day?
It's one that I can't exactly say someone gave to me, but something I discovered. Study acting. If you're going to study anything at all, get to know how to act. It's the one thing that you will use every minute you have a puppet in your hand. And when I teach now for Disney Performing Arts, and a lot of times I get acting classes from all over high school, and there's actually a college class that comes out from Austin, and I show them the importance of acting, and to show them that puppetry is based in acting first and foremost. And then learn everything you can. Learn something about dance. Learn something about playing a musical instrument. Sewing. Anytime you have to mime or mimic something, like I said, it goes back to the puppets looking real. The more you can convince the audience that this illusion is happening, everything you do comes into play. But if you don't have acting underneath it all, it's just a lot of what Van Snowden would call shake and bake. We always used to say movement without motivation was shake and bake.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of shake and bake out there, and I'll get questions from puppeteers. They say, well, they'll finish the dialogue and they'll say, well, I don't know what to do here. And it's like, what do you mean? Listen to the other actor. Act instinctively on it. Don't think about, I have to keep this puppet moving. I always teach, keep the puppet thinking. And it will move as long as you're listening and actually in the scene. You have to separate, you have to have the technique underneath your belt in order to make the art on top. If you're having to think about, so many little technical details, then you're not going to be doing the script right or whatever. You have to have that mastered, and to master it, rehearse.
Yeah.
A lot of times you don't get the luxury of rehearsal in film and TV. It's set the camera and go. So you rely on those experiences that only live theater can really teach you, where you get a chance to hone things like that, and then you bring that to the set. And then, of course, the faster you can work, the happier people are, because it's a money game, folks.
That's right.
It's not art.
That's right. Who is a puppeteer you think every puppeteer should know and should take a look at their stuff and study?
Well, anyone who knows me knows that there's only one person, and that is the late, great Wayland Flowers with Madam. Wayland... David Copperfield said he wasn't a puppeteer, said he was an illusionist. And by that, Madam was so real. I mean, she was ugly, she was bawdy. Folks, she was a blue act. But first of all, she spoke what everybody was thinking in the 70s and the 80s. I mean, this was a very liberal time sexually and such. And here was your grandmother, still going strong. Well, that was funny onto itself and her antics. But Wayland had such incredible comedic timing. He could take a joke and toss it around, and he would create pictures verbally and then hit this punchline that would just send you flying. But the reason David referred to him as an illusionist was Wayland worked like a ventriloquist, but he wasn't. Mm-hmm. His mouth was moving, but his movements with Madam were so real and so convincing that you stopped watching him. I'm doing a documentary on Waylon, and Jay Johnson said that 10 minutes after a performance, Waylon could go to a lineup and nobody would know who he was. That was how much he disappeared under this character. Until there were those moments when Madam and Waylon would have a conversation with each other. Mm-hmm. And Waylon had this wonderful technique about hiding his mouth a little bit behind the microphone, which was usually on a stand when he was doing her voice. And then he'd step away from it a little bit so you could see his mouth. But they would carry on a conversation with the two of them, and you'd swear it was two different people up there carrying on. But one of the reasons I use Waylon as an example of superb puppetry, he could do the comedy because he had all of his technical down. And if you watch his use of rods, first and foremost, he's like a concert pianist who doesn't have to look at the keys of the piano or a piece of music. He could put those rods down, change to just one, and then go back and pick the other one up, and it was smooth as silk. And Madam also, because she was modeled after a lot of women in Waylon's family, she didn't just do arms flying. She had gestures. Mm-hmm. She had specific gestures that she did. The pushing up of the hair in the back, and she would play with her hands a lot, which I understand came from his aunt, how she was always rubbing her knuckles. And if you watch Waylon, and I encourage you to do so, there's a lot of stuff on YouTube. Watch Madam move, because every once in a while she put her hands down on the little area where she was sitting, and she would push herself up and rearrange the weight on her hip. It served two purposes. One, so that Waylon could move his arm a little bit to get blood back going, but he disguised it as though she was shifting her weight on the chair. I think, in my opinion, he was one of the greatest puppeteers that the United States ever had.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember vividly as a kid seeing him, and it was just as fascinating to me as watching the Muppets or watching anything else, was to see, and I think I knew at the time, well, they're talking about adult stuff, but It was still captivating to me to watch him.
Yeah. Well, of course, on TV, this was another area where he was a master of the double entendre.
Right.
Because he couldn't say what he would verbally say in the nightclubs. The only way to really see the true Waylon was in a nightclub. And I tell you, in Atlanta, because Waylon was from Georgia, when I was working at the Croft Theater, everybody was telling me about this puppeteer with this puppet named Madam and how filthy she was. And of course I was too young to go into the clubs to see her. But eventually I got to see, Waylon live. I eventually met him briefly before he died. And he's just mesmerizing. And even to this day, when I'm working on the documentary or I'm looking back, I say I'm just going to look at this one section, and I end up sitting watching the whole thing because the puppet is so real.
Yeah.
So real. As are his other characters, Crazy Mary, who was AWOL from Bellevue, and Jiffy, who was his streetwalker hooker. That was her occupation. So, and some of those jokes about her life as a prostitute are hysterical.
Yeah. Well, I think everybody definitely, if you have not seen Madam in action, you have to go check it out. It is a must-see.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Most definitely. And watch it first, because that's what you're going to do. You're going to get caught up in it. But try to separate a second watching and just look at the technique from a puppeteer point of view, and you will see just how smooth and how wonderful he was. And then go back and study him for how he did his comedy. Of course, comedy can only be taught up to a point. This was an instinct that he had, and he had a comedic timing like all the best comics.
Yeah.
So, and Waylon was an entertainer's entertainer. When he was appearing at clubs in L.A., the celebrities were in the audience because they would go to watch Waylon to be entertained. That's how good he was.
Yeah. Okay, for this next question, you don't have to name specifics if you don't want to, but as puppeteers, we have to go on auditions, and I would love to know, what was the worst audition experience you ever had?
Oh, gosh. I have to be honest with you. Auditioning is a technique unto itself, and it's one of which I'm not necessarily the best example to, because I was fortunate enough that I had been in the business from such an early age. I got a lot of my work just from word of mouth. It was a time when there were a lot of jobs going on, and people would call me up and say, I can't do this. Are you free to take over this job for me? They would recommend me, and I would do the same, if I thought they were right for a role that was coming up. The only I auditioned for Men in Black because everyone had to for that, with Tony Urbano, who was the master puppeteer in charge. But there always there's something that would go wrong when I did audition, and of course you do the best audition in the car on your way home.
Right, exactly.
And I would leave thinking I failed. Sometimes, usually when I thought I had failed, was usually when I got the call back. I think the best thing to do, though, when you're auditioning is to try to block out, am I good or am I bad right now? My acting coach, M.K. Lewis, used to say we have a part of us that's called the bad parent, and that's that part of you that steps out and judges you while you're doing something. And if we were doing it in our acting exercises and he would recognize it, we were supposed to cuss it out and then take a moment, get back into character, and try to do it in the moment. Some people can do that without working at it. They go in and they draw upon their experience. But I was always trying to second guess what they wanted, and for that reason, I guess you would say almost every audition I went on was less than wonderful. But eventually, some came through. But I was so incredibly fortunate to come up at the time that I did.
Well, and even today, though, I think a lot of that is, like you talked about, knowing your sort of contemporaries and knowing what skills they have and recommending each other for jobs is, and we've talked about this before in the podcast, is networking, is knowing people.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And being nice to everybody, folks.
Right.
I can't express that enough, as I always tell people, if you think you're more important than your stagehands, let's see how good your performance is when the curtain doesn't go up and the lights stay off.
Right.
Be as nice as you can to people, be cooperative, and work, and that's where your next job's going to come from. Because I would get called from producers, and because they like working with me. It doesn't necessarily mean you're the greatest that ever came along, but they want people that will work well with others, get the job done, and stay in a positive mode. And my dad and mom always taught me that. We weren't allowed to be negative. So that helped.
Now, are you a builder as well? Do you build puppets?
I used to in my youth, because there was no place to really get them but FAO Schwartz. And I wanted more advanced puppets. I did learn sculpture, and I would make them out of wood dough and the very toxic Celastic that is now against the law in this country. But I would do some foam things. I preferred, though, at one point to specialize in just the performance aspect of it. I didn't have the patience sometimes that you need to make puppets. I've had to make them for myself, because sometimes you're the only one that knows what you want. But I think you have to know something about the construction of puppets, because you're able to do repairs and things, and or if you're talking to a builder, you need to be able to instruct them in some way, or a designer, as to what you need as a performer. And so you have to do some building to understand what they are going through, most definitely.
Yeah. Well, you can't run upstairs to the teacher to help you untangle your
no
marionette strings
exactly
all the time. You have to do it yourself.
Exactly. Well, that was of course trial and error.
Right.
When you're dealing with 14 feet of string on the Croft stage and you had 30 minutes between shows, you learned how to untangle marionettes quickly.
What do you do during those times when, unfortunately, there is no puppetry work? Do you have other projects that you work on? I mean, you mentioned a documentary, but do you have other things you do as well?
Well, I still play cello and still study music, so I play with a string quartet and a few orchestras around town. So my music keeps me going, but I'm always thinking up acts and such. I'm kind of an idea person. I just gave one to a puppeteer that I admire greatly in the LA Guild because something just came up. My mind's always thinking about it. And I have a character now that's, I guess, starting to take off, a dancer. It's a humanette by the name of Irina Bunyan-Fushkaya. And it's my face, but a puppet's body. And it's a tribute to the Ballet Trocadero de Monte Carlo. And if you're not familiar with Les Ballet Trocadero de Monte Carlo, they came about in the 70s. It was an all-male ballet troupe, and they parody famous ballets. And at the time, all the dancers were supposed to be from Eastern Bloc countries, and the guys would come out in tutus, but they'd have hair on their chest and under their arms, but in the face. And next to some wonderful puppetry in Wayland, my other favorite evenings in a theater was watching Ballet Trocadero de Monte Carlo. And so Irina is my tribute to them.
Yeah.
And so her ballets are all done in style. And so I'm always thinking of ballets that she can do. And we started with The Dying Swan, which was a famous piece that not only in the ballet world with Anna Pavlova, but the parody that the Trocaderos did was just hysterical. And we started with that. So I have several ballets. She does the Nutcracker, the Grand Pas de Deux with a pair of white gloves and fabric. And she does Carmen, where she fights death with, he has the sickle and she uses the rose from her mouth as her sword. And I'm also the Caprice Egyptian, which if you want to see it, you can see online if you Google Thom, Thom, Fountain, Caprice Egyptian. You can see Irina at Puppet Slam. And we actually got to go to Atlanta this year as one of 8 acts chosen for the National Puppet Slam. Yeah. And it was a trip to be able to go back to my own native hometown to do this character where I started. It sort of came full circle. And I'm working on a new one now, The Sleeping Beauty, where the evil queen puts her to sleep with Ambien tablets. And the prince comes in and nobody can wake her up, including the forest creatures. And they try everything under the sun to get her to awake so she can, at least the kiss doesn't work. Nothing works. She literally is sleeping through the whole ballet.
The whole thing,
Yes. So that's the kind of stuff I love to do, and my mind stays on it. And being a musician, when I listen to music, music gives me ideas.
Yeah.
Constantly.
Yeah.
For not just the ballerina, but everything. Music has always been my muse. Always.
Yeah, I can see that. I'm a little bit like that too, where music or sometimes for me sound effects, where it's like, oh, this sound effect would be hilarious with this thing. Yeah.
Exactly. And then to be able to incorporate them both. I mean, I hope to have this ballet finished soon, but they bring up a whole bunch of instruments quickly to try to wake her up. Anything under the sun that could wake up a person, rooster, whatever, it's in there, and nothing works.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned the Los Angeles Guild, and I want to and you're very involved with the Los Angeles Guild of Puppetry.
I'm the current president. I've got 3 more months left.
But do you recommend that puppeteers seek out their local guild and join and get involved?
I think it's very important because, like you said, that's where the networking comes from. Mm-hmm. And especially in Los Angeles, we have so many professional puppeteers that this is their living. This is what they work. The more you get to see them and get to know them, that's a connection right there. It doesn't necessarily have to be a producer or a director. It can just be a peer. And the guilds do a lot of great things. The puppet slams, which they have nationwide, are a great way to test something. For those of you who aren't quite aware what puppet slams are, they're the equivalent of an open mic night for comedians. You create something 5 minutes or less, and you get on an evening of puppet slams. The guild produces 3 a year, and you can get something that is incredibly polished and good, something that is promising and going, and some things that just aren't going to work. But the only way you can find it out is to put it on a stage. You know, you can create in your mind and envision the way it's going to be, but the audience is your ultimate test of anything.
Well, it was like you're saying, doing, how many shows did you do at the Sid and Marty Krofft Theater a day? 10 shows a day,
10 shows a day.
Like the only way you're going to get good at it is by doing it.
Exactly.
Doing it as much as you can, anywhere you can.
Exactly. And every audience was different. Talking about that, could I talk about a lesson that I got in those early days at Krofft? We used, in the show Hooray for Hollywood, we had these puppets of the Andrews Sisters. And they were singing Bette Midler's Boogie Woogie Bugle Boy of Company B. They were attached to a board that was all decorated like a stage of an orchestra, but they had a hand that was our hand in a glove that went through one hole, and the other hand went into the mouth to work the mouth. And it was okay. The puppets looked all right. But then all of a sudden, like shortly after we opened the show, we got a note that we were supposed to make them humanettes. And so overnight, we had to cut out the frame. We put Mylar in there, and they sent 3 wigs in the style of the Andrews Sisters, and then we were given another glove for our left hand, and we basically were the puppet's body, but we were the 2 hands and the head. Well, we didn't have a rehearsal for it. It just was in the next day. And in my haste to get in, I was the middle one, whichever one she was. Without me knowing, I did not put the wig on properly. It was tucked under in the back of my head. So we started doing the same routine with the arms, and the wig started to slide. And I had this problem on my hands trying to keep the wig on, and I was constantly having to push it up, and I knew that I was trying not to move too much, but correct it. Then all of a sudden, and the audience was getting more and more hysterical. And then at the very end, we had to open up these skirts with both hands. I couldn't fix the wig. The wig fell off, and the audience screamed, and I must have had this absolute look of horror on my face. The lights went out. I got backstage, and I thought, hey, I can make an audience laugh. So the next shows, whatever, I kept trying to make the audience laugh, and I couldn't understand why was it not working like it did the first time. And that was a lesson in comedy that it wasn't real. And as Barry Sonnenfeld used to say on the set of Men in Black, constantly, I think he was giving this to Will Smith at one point in the the first episode of the trilogy. He would say, if you want to be funny, don't try to be funny.
Yeah.
It wasn't explained like that when I learned the lesson, but I realized that you can't force it. And I realized my reactions were very real because I had a dilemma on my hands and I reacted instinctively.
Yeah.
And the trick is to try to recreate that later on. That was an early theater lesson. And folks, you couldn't get that on film or TV.
Yeah.
You only had an audience had to tell you what was right and what was wrong on that.
Yeah.
Thank you for letting me
say that. Of course.
But it's a lesson that stands out in my mind.
Yeah. What is, as we're wrapping up here, what has been your most memorable moment on set so far?
Easily. 7 years on Sabrina the Teenage Witch with Salem the Talking Cat.
Yeah.
Every day, it was a puppeteer's dream to go to work. First of all, we had a cast and crew that everybody got along, and I know this sounds like an Emmy or an Oscar speech. We really were like a family. When the producers, Paula Hart and Ken Cook. When they threw a party, it wasn't just for the cast. The painters, the set builders, everybody was always invited to everything. And I think that shows on the screen. Salem, they gave me full reign and freedom to do whatever the script needed. And sometimes I had to demonstrate them. But it was fun, too, because Salem was the only puppet in a live sitcom. It wasn't like a Muppets where I was surrounded by puppeteers. There were 3 of us to work this one character in a room of comedians and wonderful actresses. And for 166 episodes over 7 years, I never took a day that I drove to Paramount Studios for granted. It was something every week. And I always referred to it I always got the scripts 3 weeks in advance because of the prepping I had to do and the building or things I had to design for the builders to do to make it work. And it was like Christmas morning, reading a new script. What does Salem get to do this week? The writers actually asked me, after we realized Salem was taking off, they said, could you give us a list of what the puppet can and cannot do? And I said, no, because as a puppeteer, I will block you. I said, you just write. The fun is trying to figure out how to make your vision happen. And if I can't make it happen cleanly, then I'll let you know. But I think there was only one time out of all those episodes that we had to do an alternate thing that just wasn't going to work well with the puppet. But yeah, it was a dream show for me.
Well, Tommy, I really appreciate you coming by to talk to us. I'm going to put links to your IMDb page and your YouTube page in the show notes for this episode so people can go check it out. But thank you so much. I really appreciate your time.
Grant, this has been so nice. It's, as you get older and you feel like people aren't going to remember you, and then you come along with an email and say, I want to interview. I thank you so much. And guys, just keep creating. Be positive, be nice, and don't let anything stop you. Persevere. You'll be happy at the very end. Believe me.
Thank you so much, Tommy. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Grant.
I have to say that after I stopped recording, Thom and I talked for another 15-20 minutes about stuff we hadn't even covered in the interview. So I will definitely have to have Thom back on in the future. For now, though, you can check out links to Thom's IMDb and YouTube pages in the post for this episode, episode number 5, over at underthepuppet.com. Well, now it's time for this episode's next step in your Puppeteer action plan. As you heard, Thom is a big advocate for seeking out and joining your local puppetry guild. Guilds are a great place to connect with fellow puppeteers and check out other forms of puppetry. A simple web search of your city's name with the words Puppetry Guild should point you in the right direction. Now, if you live in a smaller town, you may have to search for the nearest big city. Another good place to search for local puppeteers is through the Puppeteers of America website at puppeteers.org. Internationally, you could seek out UNIMA, which is UNIMA, which is the international collective of puppeteers, and they will point you in the right direction. Find your nearest guild, get involved, and network. You never know who you're going to meet. Well, that's going to do it for this episode of Under the Puppet. I welcome your feedback via email at hello@SaturdayMorningMedia.com or via Twitter, where the show is at username Under the Puppet. I want to hear your suggestions for questions I should be asking and for future guests. Also, the goal for this show is to talk to puppeteers making it happen in all sorts of styles of puppetry. So if you know an amazing Bunraku or shadow puppet artist, please reach out. Let me know who I should be talking to. Thank you so much for listening. Talk to you next time on Under the Puppet. Under the Puppet is a production of Saturday Morning Media and is made possible by the Saturday Morning Media Patreon patrons who've gone to patreon.com/Saturday Morning Media and set up a monthly donation for as little as $1 a month. Huge thanks to Shay Stewart, Mer Lafferty, Jeff Peterson, Dale Gadania, Stephen Staver, Jackie Klimo, Melissa Crawford, Dave Slusher of the Evil Genius Chronicles, Mike Coughlin, Dorothy Pachoco, John D., Kathy Crawford, Brian Greer, Carrie Whitney, Chuck Tomasi from the Technorama podcast, Chris Foster, Stephen Ing, Clinton of ComedyForecast.com, Vicky DeVries, Mike Wabshall, Twitter user Butzengear, a.k.a. Wildcat, Eve Cunning, Mike Hamilton, Gaston Moreno, Reed Loveland, Ivan Asquith, Vanessa Whitney, Nancy McCarthy, Janine Lee, Peggy Etra, Kristen Hogan of Squid Friends, and David Akers. If you'd like to support this show and the other fun content from Saturday Morning Media, become a patron. Head on over to patreon.com/Saturday Morning Media and set up your monthly donation today. You can also tell a friend about the show or leave the show a review on iTunes. And while you're over there on iTunes, be sure to click that subscribe button. That way you'll help more people find out about the show, and you'll get episodes the moment they are released. Under the Puppet is copyright 2017 Saturday Morning Media, Grant Bachoco, executive producer, all rights reserved. www.saturdaymorningmedia.com. You've been listening to Saturday Morning Media. Stay tuned. We'll be right back.